The Holocaust was a systematic, state-sponsored extermination campaign orchestrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II. This atrocity led to the deaths of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others. The Nazis referred to this horrific plan as the final solution to the Jewish question. The term Holocaust is derived from the Greek word holocauston, which translates to a burnt sacrifice offered whole to God. This term was chosen as a reference to the extermination camps where victims' bodies were incinerated in crematoria and open fires. However, the term Holocaust carries religious connotations that some find uncomfortable. In Yiddish-speaking communities and among survivors, the event was initially called the Hurban, a term historically used to describe the destruction of the First and Second Temples in Jerusalem. This word emphasizes the catastrophic nature of the genocide. In Israel and France, and among Hebrew speakers, the term Shoah, meaning catastrophe, is often preferred. This term gained broader recognition following Claude Lanzmann's influential 1985 documentary titled Shoah. Shoah specifically highlights the unique suffering of the Jewish people during this period, distinguishing it from the broader context of Nazi atrocities. Distinguished historians have also used specific terms to describe the Holocaust. Raoul Hilberg referred to it as the destruction of the European Jews, and Lucy S. Dawidowicz called it the war against the Jews. Dawidowicz's title underscores the dual nature of Nazi Germany's objectives, fighting World War II and waging a racial war against the Jews. The Allies, however, were engaged solely in the global conflict. The term Holocaust covers not only the annihilation of Jews, but also the persecution and murder of other groups targeted by the Nazi regime. However, terms like Shoah and the war against the Jews focus more narrowly on the Jewish experience, emphasizing the specific intent to annihilate the Jewish population. The roots of Nazi anti-Semitism can be traced back to the early writings and ideology of Adolf Hitler. Even before the Nazis ascended to power in Germany in 1933, their anti-Semitic views were well publicized. In 1919, Hitler wrote about what he termed rational anti-Semitism, advocating for systematic legal opposition and ultimately the complete removal of Jews. In his book Mein Kampf, published between 1925 and 1927, Hitler expanded on his belief that Jews were an evil race seeking world domination. This ideology was not confined to one dimension. It was an amalgamation of religious, political, and racial anti-Semitism. Religious anti-Semitism, which had existed for centuries, could theoretically be resolved through conversion. Political anti-Semitism could be addressed through expulsion. However, Nazi racial anti-Semitism viewed Jews as an inherent racial threat that could only be eradicated through annihilation. Nazi racial ideology classified Jews as Untermenschen, or subhumans, and depicted them as a race rather than a religious group. This racial perspective laid the groundwork for their systematic discrimination and eventual extermination. Hitler's worldview centered on two primary concepts: territorial expansion for greater Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, and the idea of racial supremacy. After World War I, the Allies denied Germany colonies in Africa, prompting Hitler to seek territorial expansion within Europe to secure food and resources. In this context, Hitler viewed Jews as racial polluters and a cancer on German society. This belief system has been termed redemptive anti-Semitism by Holocaust survivor and historian Saul Friedlander, focusing on the idea of redeeming Germany by purging it of Jewish influence. Historian Timothy Snyder characterized this struggle as even more elemental, describing it as a zoological and ecological battle of species. Hitler opposed Jews for the values they represented: social justice and compassionate assistance to the weak, which he believed stood in the way of the natural order where the powerful dominate. In his view, any restraint on the exercise of power would weaken and ultimately defeat the so-called master race. When Hitler legally came to power on January 30th, 1933, his immediate goal was to consolidate power and eliminate political opposition. The assault on Jews began almost immediately. On April 1st, 1933, the Nazis initiated a boycott of Jewish businesses. A week later, Jews were dismissed from civil service positions. By the end of that month, Jewish participation in German schools was restricted by a quota system. On May 10, 1933, Nazi students and professors stormed university libraries and bookstores across 30 cities in Germany, burning tens of thousands of books written by Jewish authors and those opposed to Nazi ideology. This event echoed the words of Heinrich Heine, a German poet of Jewish origin, who had said a century earlier, "Where one burns books, one will, in the end, burn people." In Nazi Germany, the time between the burning of books and the burning of people was a mere 8 years. As the discrimination escalated, the need for a legal definition of a Jew and an Aryan became apparent. The Nürnberg Laws, promulgated on September 15, 1935, were the centerpiece of Nazi anti-Jewish legislation. These laws prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood, and stripped Jews of their civil and political rights, reducing them to mere subjects of the state. The laws formally divided Germans and Jews without clearly defining either term. This task was left to the Nazi bureaucracy, which categorized Jews based on ancestry rather than religious or personal identity. Those with at least 3 Jewish grandparents were classified as Jews, while those with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were labeled Mischlinge, or mixed breeds. This categorization was the first stage in the systematic destruction of the Jewish people. Following the Nazis' rise to power in January 1933, a series of increasingly repressive measures were implemented against the Jewish population. These measures began almost immediately and were designed to isolate, disenfranchise, and eventually annihilate the Jewish community in Germany and later in occupied territories. On April 1, 1933, the Nazi regime initiated a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. This marked the first organized action against Jews under Hitler's leadership. Signs were posted outside Jewish-owned shops and businesses, warning Germans not to buy from Jews. This boycott was intended to economically and socially isolate Jews from the rest of German society. Just a week later, Jews were dismissed from civil service positions. This was formalized by the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, which excluded Jews and other political opponents from all government jobs. This measure was a significant step in removing Jews from public life and reducing their influence in society. By the end of April 1933, the participation of Jews in German schools was restricted by a quota system, limiting the number of Jewish students who could attend public schools. This was part of a broader effort to segregate Jews from the rest of the population and deny them access to education and professional advancement. On May 10, 1933, a more symbolic and cultural attack occurred. Nazi students, along with many professors, stormed university libraries and bookstores across 30 cities in Germany. Tens of thousands of books written by Jewish authors and those who opposed Nazi ideology were thrown into bonfires. This event was intended to cleanse German culture of what the Nazis considered un-Germanic influences. It was a stark demonstration of the regime's intent to eradicate Jewish intellectual and cultural contributions to society. The escalation of anti-Jewish policies continued with the introduction of the Nürnberg Laws on September 15, 1935. These laws became the legal cornerstone of Nazi racial policy and laid the groundwork for further persecution. The Nürnberg Laws included the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, and the Reich citizenship law, which stripped Jews of their German citizenship and reduced them to subjects of the state. The Nürnberg Laws necessitated a legal definition of who was considered Jewish. The Nazi regime categorized individuals as Jews if they had at least 3 Jewish grandparents. Those with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were labeled Mischlinge, or mixed breeds. This racial categorization was not based on religious practice or personal identity, but purely on ancestry. This bureaucratic classification was the first step in the systematic destruction of the Jewish people, as it allowed the Nazis to identify and target Jews more efficiently. The implementation of these anti-Jewish policies set the stage for further persecution and eventual genocide. The legal and social isolation of Jews was a critical component of the Nazis' strategy, ensuring that Jews were increasingly marginalized and stripped of their rights, property, and humanity. These early actions created the conditions necessary for the mass deportations, ghettos, and extermination camps that would follow in the later stages of the Holocaust. As the Nazi regime intensified its persecution, the Jewish community reacted with a combination of resilience, defiance, and desperation. Faced with escalating discrimination and violence, many Jews sought to defend their rights as German citizens. For those who had fought patriotically for Germany in World War I, the betrayal was particularly painful. Efforts to maintain dignity and identity became crucial. Zionist activity saw a significant increase during this period. Organizations and leaders within the Jewish community encouraged the embrace of Jewish identity, which the Nazis had so viciously stigmatized. In 1933, journalist Robert Welch urged Jews to wear it with pride. This call was echoed by influential figures like religious philosopher Martin Buber, who led initiatives in Jewish adult education to prepare the community for the arduous times ahead. In 1935, Rabbi Leo Beck circulated a prayer for Yom Kippur, instructing Jews on how to conduct themselves. We bow down before God. We stand erect before man. Despite these efforts, the situation for Jews in Germany was becoming increasingly perilous. By the late 1930s, the search for refuge became a desperate priority for many Jewish families. Those who could acquire visas and meet stringent emigration quotas sought to leave Germany. A significant number looked to the United States as a haven, but immigration policies were restrictive. Palestine emerged as another destination, where the small Jewish community was more willing to accept refugees. However, the search for refuge was fraught with challenges. Most countries were unwilling to accept large numbers of Jewish refugees, often citing economic or social reasons. The international community's response to the crisis was largely inadequate. A poignant example of this was the Evian Conference, convened by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in July 1938 in Evian-les-Bains, France. The Evian Conference aimed to address the issue of Jewish refugees, but it was hampered by limitations from the outset. Roosevelt's invitation to government leaders specified that they would not be required to change their immigration laws or allocate government funds for resettlement. Instead, only philanthropic resources were to be used. Additionally, Britain ensured that the topic of resettling refugees in Palestine would not be on the agenda. Given these constraints, the conference accomplished very little. While representatives from 32 countries attended, most were unwilling to make significant commitments to accept Jewish refugees. The outcome was disappointing and underscored the international community's reluctance to confront the humanitarian crisis head-on. The Jewish community's response to increasing persecution was marked by a combination of resilience, attempts to emigrate, and the bitter realization that international efforts were insufficient. This period of searching for refuge highlighted the dire circumstances Jews faced and the limited avenues available to escape the growing menace of Nazi persecution. The lack of effective international action left many Jews with few options, setting the stage for the catastrophic events that would follow.